The question hit me like a cold splash of water: can a 72-hour fence ultimatum actually derail a home sale? I was standing in my kitchen, early sun slanting through the blinds, when the email landed with that smug little urgent subject line. 3 days to cut down the fence that had protected my backyard for years, or face fines that would stack up faster than my moving boxes. I read it twice, then a third time, because surely I was missing something. We were already under contract, inspections were scheduled, and the buyers had said, through our agent, that the privacy fence was one of the reasons they felt good about the place. It was the quiet, tucked-away vibe of our cul-de-sac that made the whole property feel like a sanctuary. And now the association was basically saying, chop it down or pay for our attitude. The most surreal part? The tone. Not just strict. Personal. Like the board was tapping a nail through my plans, trying to pin me in place. I could have panicked right there. I could have fired back a messy reply, called my agent in a spiral, or started Googling half-baked advice. But something in me went still instead, like the air before a thunderstorm. I'd lived through enough homeowners association drama to know that when power gets bored, it starts hunting for a toy. And today, apparently, that toy was my fence. I opened the attached final notice dated May 12th and stared at the bolded line that said our fence was confirmed non-compliant by new survey. Confirmed by who? New survey for what? We hadn't had any boundary disputes, no new construction, no reason for anyone to suddenly care about 6 inches of wood and paint. Unless, this wasn't about boundaries at all. By the time I finished that thought, my stomach had already picked a side. This wasn't random. It was targeted. And if they wanted a quick surrender, they'd picked the wrong house. I took a slow breath, listening to the soft hum of the fridge, and decided I wasn't going to be the one rushing. If there was a game happening, I was going to learn the rules before I flipped the board. Let me rewind a bit, because none of this makes sense without the neighborhood vibe. Our cul-de-sac is one of those little loops that feels like its own micro-world. 12 homes, mature trees, mailboxes lined like polite little soldiers. On warm evenings, you can hear sprinklers ticking and kids laughing 2 streets over, even if you don't see them. It's calm. Almost too calm, which is usually where these stories start. When we bought the house 8 years ago, the fence was already there, 6 feet tall, stained a neutral cedar, clean and uniform. The previous owners had installed it because the backyard sits slightly lower than the neighboring lots. Without a tall fence, it feels like you're on display. With it, it's a private pocket of quiet. Back then, the association's rules were simple: fences, maybe up to 6 feet as long as they match the approved style. That's pulled straight from our community guidelines, CCR Section 4.3, the Fence and Exterior Rule. I kept that binder like it was a birth certificate because our board had a reputation even then. Not a villain reputation necessarily, but a board sheriff in a small-town vibe. The board shifted every couple of years. Some members were normal, some were intense but fair, and then there was one person who turned ordinary stuff into theater. Every neighborhood has one. I'll call her Ms. R. She wasn't officially president, but she functioned like the gravity in the room. When she walked into a meeting, everything started orbiting her opinions. You know the type. She'd smile at you in the driveway, then email the management company about your trash bins being visible from the street. She'd bring cookies to the block party, then casually remind everyone about paint tones approved for shutters. At first, I didn't really care. I work a pretty steady job, keep my front tidy, and I'm not interested in arguing over lawn height. But over the years, a pattern formed. Rules didn't matter until Ms. R decided they mattered. Then suddenly they were sacred. Last fall, she tried to push a rule change limiting backyard structures to 4 feet. She framed it as preserving sightlines and keeping curb appeal consistent. The thing is, you can't even see most backyard fences from the street in our loop. It was about control, not beauty. The board tabled that change after a bunch of neighbors pushed back. Some people wrote polite emails. A couple showed up at meetings in sweatshirts and quiet fury. I didn't make a big scene, But I did send one note pointing out that CCR Section 4.3 allowed 6 feet already, and any rewrite would need a community vote. Ms. R didn't love that. You could tell by the way she looked right through me at the next meeting, like I'd become a smudge on a window she wanted clean. Then, a few months later, when we quietly listed the house to move closer to family, she got even sharper. Nothing obvious. Just tiny paper cuts of stress. A reminder about mulch color. A friendly note about the angle of our porch light. All stuff that never mattered before. It felt like she was watching. Waiting. And the moment she learned we were selling, the timing lines up too perfectly to ignore. When our agent told us we had an offer from a couple who loved the backyard, I finally felt the weight of moving lift a little. We signed. We scheduled. We started packing. I let myself imagine not dealing with bored emails anymore. Then the survey happened. At least, that's what they claimed. The first time I heard the word survey, it wasn't from the association. It was from my next-door neighbor, Mr. K, who waved me down while I was hauling boxes to the garage. The afternoon was bright and breezy, leaves rattling overhead, and he was wearing that expression people get when they're trying to be helpful but also worried they're about to hand you a live grenade. He told me a new boundary survey had been ordered on our block. Said he'd seen a guy with a tripod in Ms. R's yard a few mornings earlier. Mr. K thought it was weird because nobody had filed a formal dispute. The last survey in the cul-de-sac was 10 years ago when 2 homeowners swapped slivers of land to fix a driveway angle. Since then, peace. I thanked him, kept my face neutral, and watched him walk away with a slow, uneasy shuffle. A survey without a dispute is like a fire drill without a building. It's not impossible, it's just suspicious. Especially when it happens right after someone you annoyed finds out you're leaving. That evening, after the email, I pulled out my binder and reread CCR Section 4.3. 6 feet max. No mention of being adjustable due to slope. No weird sunset clause. Nothing that supported the board's message about trim to 4 feet due to new measurements. So why did the final notice say my fence was overheight by up to 22 inches? There are only 2 ways that happens. Either the rule changed and they didn't properly notify the community. Or 2, they were measuring from a different ground point than the one the rules require. Both are board-level problems, not homeowner-level mistakes. The notice also referenced an architectural compliance review scheduled for immediate enforcement. That phrase made my jaw tighten. It wasn't just an order, it was a trap. If I rushed to comply, the sale might still suffer because buyers would see chaos. If I refused without proof, I'd look like the non-compliant seller. Either way, our timeline got messy. And here's the part that made my pulse climb: the notice gave me 72 hours. Not a week. Not the usual 30-day correction window. 72 hours to cut down a 6-foot privacy fence before fines kicked in. A deadline meant to make me scramble, not to solve anything. I didn't scramble. I got curious. First, I called the management company, calm voice, simple questions. What survey? Who ordered it? Can I see the measurements? They gave me the corporate version of a shrug. The board had requested a survey to confirm alignment across multiple lots. Individual reports were not yet available, but enforcement was necessary for community standards. Translation: Ms. R wanted this, so it happened. Second, I checked our closing timeline. The buyer's inspection was in 6 days. If I cut down the fence now, it would be half-finished chaos during inspection. If I didn't cut it and fines started, the buyers might worry there was a compliance cloud over the property. Either scenario could spook a deal. The board knew that. Deadlines like that aren't about rules. They're about leverage. I looked out at my backyard through the glass door. The fence was solid, straight, and freshly sealed last summer. It wasn't sagging, wasn't unsafe, wasn't blocking any view that mattered. It was just ours. It marked a boundary I'd paid for, maintained, and lived inside. And now a board committee wanted to shrink it because a new survey, ordered in secret, said so. Nope. If they were going to play boundary games, I was going to learn every inch of this neighborhood. So that night, I walked the cul-de-sac. Not in a dramatic cloak-and-dagger way. Just me, a jacket, my phone's flashlight, and a quiet determination. The air was cool, and you could hear distant dogs barking, but our loop was mostly still. I took notes on every fence I passed. Height, style, placement. Some were clearly 6 feet. A few looked taller because of slope, just like mine. One on the opposite corner was easily 7 feet where the yard dipped. Another behind the treasurer's house had a stacked stone base plus a 6-foot panel on top. Beautiful, but definitely not 4 feet. I didn't take pictures from people's yards. I'm not trying to be that neighbor. I just stood on the sidewalk and observed what anyone could see with their own eyes. If the board was suddenly enforcing a 4-foot limit, they had a lot more fences to worry about than mine. By the time I looped back to my driveway, I had a list of 9 properties with fences at or above 6 feet, some noticeably taller than mine. 9 out of 12. That wasn't an accident. That was a community norm. Which meant if the board was targeting only me, I could prove it. And if they were truly enforcing a new interpretation, they'd have to bring the whole neighborhood into compliance. That would be a mess they weren't prepared for, especially with half the board members also non-compliant. I went inside, made tea, and opened my laptop. The final notice had a hearing date attached, 3 days from now. Same day as the ultimatum. A closed, architectural panel session, allegedly open to homeowner comment. Perfect. I printed the notice, highlighted the measured from grade language in CCR section 4.3, and pulled out the meeting minutes from last fall. In those minutes, there was a tiny line about Rule 3.14, our association's fairness clause. It states that enforcement must be consistent across similarly situated properties, and any accelerated enforcement requires documented safety risk or community vote. Rule 3.14 is the kind of thing boards forget exists until you slide it across the table. I slipped those papers into a folder labeled Closing Docs so nobody in my house would worry. Then I texted our agent a quick heads up that the board was throwing a last-minute fence compliance issue, but I was handling it. I told her not to alert the buyers yet unless it became necessary. Panic spreads faster than facts. When I finally went to bed, the ceiling fan whispered overhead, and my brain kept replaying the same thought: if Ms. R wanted a power flex, she'd picked the wrong moment. I might be leaving, but I wasn't leaving quietly. And I wasn't cutting down a perfectly legal fence because someone needed a win. The next morning, I woke up early and checked my email like it was a weather forecast. Another message waited from the management company. Same stiff tone. Same threat of fines. But this time they attached a single blurry photo of a measuring stick against my fence panel, claiming it read 6 feet 10 inches above grade. It was the kind of low-effort evidence that makes you laugh if you're not furious. No property line reference. No ground marker. No note about slope. Just a random stick and a confident caption. That photo was my second evidence prop, whether they knew it or not. Because if they were going to play gotcha, they'd need better receipts. I stepped outside to look at the fence in daylight. The sky was a pale blue, and dew still clung to the grass near the base. The fence followed the natural slope of my yard, which means that grade is different depending on where you stand. I knew exactly where they'd taken that photo, likely from the lowest dip. If you measure from there without leveling to the adjacent grade, you can make any fence look too tall. It's like measuring a bookshelf from the basement floor and acting shocked it's higher than the living room ceiling. I walked the perimeter, noting the spots where the ground dipped and where the fence rose. The panels themselves were standard 6-foot sections. The only reason any part looked taller was because my yard sits lower than the neighbor behind me, who, by the way, also had a 6-foot fence on their side. Which made me wonder if they'd sent him a notice too. I didn't ask yet. I didn't want to tip my hand. Instead, I drafted a calm reply stating I disputed the measurement method, requested the full survey report and measurement protocol, and noted that CCR Section 4.3 authorized 6 feet. I also asked for the documented reason for accelerated 72-hour enforcement. I didn't mention Rule 3.14 yet. That was my pocket card for the hearing. They replied within an hour with the shortest version of no, the board's decision was final pending homeowner compliance. You know that moment when someone tells you they're not listening, and you realize they never plan to? Yeah. That moment. So I leaned into my plan. That afternoon, I expanded my list into a simple neighborhood map. Nothing creepy, just a sketch of the cul-de-sac with fence heights noted from sidewalk view. I marked mine in red, others in blue. 9 blue fences. 1 red fence. The pattern looked like a neon sign. Consistent enforcement wasn't happening. Selective enforcement was. I also pulled the public plat records attached to our original purchase documents. I didn't need to be a surveyor, I just needed to show that the board couldn't demand modifications without providing the survey they claimed to be relying on. Then I waited. Not in a passive way. In a coiled spring way. Because the hearing was coming, and I could already feel what Ms. R's plan was. She'd show up armed with that blurry stick photo, frame me as the departing homeowner who doesn't care about the community, and try to rush a vote before anyone asked questions. She'd want a quick, clean humiliation. Something she could brag about over a neat stack of meeting packets. What she didn't know was that I had her own neighborhood in my folder. And the thing about boundaries, real ones, not survey games, is that they work both ways. By the end of that day, I was tired but weirdly steady. I wasn't fighting for a fence anymore. I was fighting for the idea that rules don't become weapons just because someone on a board feels petty. And if the association wanted to make this a public example, I was ready to make sure the example didn't go the way they expected. Hearing day arrived with that gray, breath-holding kind of morning, the one where even the birds sound like they're waiting for something. I'd slept fine, but I woke up already primed, like my brain had been pacing the hallway all night. I kept my routine normal on purpose. Coffee. A quick sweep of the kitchen. One last check of my folder. Final notice dated May 12th on top. CCR Section 4.3 highlighted. Meeting minutes with Rule 3.14 circled. My sketch map folded neatly, not flashy, just precise. Then I drove to the clubhouse with a calm I didn't totally trust. The architectural panel hearing was scheduled for 9:30 a.m., but by 9:15 there were already a few cars in the lot. That alone told me this wasn't just about my fence. People show up early when they smell a show. Inside, the room looked exactly like every association meeting room I've ever been in, folding chairs in rows, harsh overhead lights, and that faint smell of leftover toner. The board sat at a long table with their laptops and paper stacks like they were prepping for trial. Ms. R was there, of course, sitting slightly forward in her chair, posture polished, eyes scanning like she was counting points before the game even started. The committee chair opened with the usual procedural stuff. My case was item 3 on the agenda, labeled Fence Height Compliance, Lot 7. Seeing my home reduced to a number made something in me clench, but I let it pass. I wasn't here to make a speech. I was here to make it impossible for them to pretend this was normal. Items 1 and 2 were quick. A shed placement issue. A mailbox repaint reminder. Both got the gentle, 30-day correction window. No threats. No drama. Then my item came up. The chair summarized the new survey findings, flipping through a thin packet like he was handling a sealed secret. He said the survey confirmed my rear fence exceeded allowed height and that accelerated enforcement was necessary to maintain uniformity. Uniformity. In a cul-de-sac full of fences taller than mine. I waited until he finished. The air conditioner clicked on softly overhead. Then I spoke evenly and simple, asking for something that should have been easy, the actual survey report and the measurement method they used. The chair hesitated. Ms. R didn't. She leaned in with that ready-to-pounce energy and claimed the survey was board-commissioned, and that my fence was clearly above grade. She referenced the blurry stick photo like it was a smoking gun. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to keep her talking. People like her reveal their script if you let them. She went on about protecting property values, which almost made me laugh out loud given we were literally in escrow. She suggested that my fence height was visually imposing and that I'd been reminded before. That last part was new. A casual lie dropped like a pebble into a pond, hoping nobody noticed the ripples. I asked the chair to point to any prior notices I'd received. He flipped again, slower this time, and quietly admitted there weren't any. Ms. R tried to pivot to verbal reminders, but the chair cut her off. "We deal in written records," he said. That line wasn't a victory yet, but it was a crack. So I widened it. I placed my folder on the table edge and slid out CCR section 4.3, pointing to the 6-foot allowance and the ground grade clause. I explained that my panels were standard 6-foot sections and that selective measuring from the lowest dip was not consistent with the rule's intent. If they believed otherwise, I needed the survey in full. A couple of board members exchanged looks. The treasurer tapped his pen. Someone in the audience shifted. The energy changed from "we're catching a rule breaker" to "why is this homeowner holding receipts?" Ms. R's face stayed polite, but her eyes sharpened. She said the survey wasn't ready for distribution. I let that sit for half a beat. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Then I asked a second, simpler question. If the survey wasn't ready, how could they justify immediate enforcement and a 72-hour deadline? That's when I saw it. The chair's uncertainty. A board member's blink that lasted just a second too long. They didn't expect questions that fit inside their own rules. The chair offered a vague answer about time sensitivity. Ms. R jumped in, saying that since I was selling, the board needed to resolve compliance before transfer. That sounded reasonable in a vacuum, which is why she said it. But with the paperwork in front of us, it didn't hold. CCR section 4.3 doesn't link fence height to sale status. An accelerated enforcement without safety risk triggers Rule 3.14, whether they like it or not. I didn't mention that yet. I just looked around the room and asked if any other fences in the cul-de-sac had been cited as part of community-wide uniformity. Silence. Ms. R said something about starting with the highest concern areas, which is code 4, starting with what I care about. The treasurer finally asked what I meant. I unfolded my sketch map. No theatrics. Just paper. Lots, fences, heights. 9 properties over 6 feet, most matching the same style we'd all used for years. I explained I'd walked the loop, measured visually from public view, and that my fence was not an outlier, it was consistent with neighborhood norms. If they were enforcing a 4-foot interpretation now, they needed to apply it consistently across similarly situated properties. That was Rule 3.14 without saying Rule 3.14. A teaser, not the reveal. A woman in the audience made a little sound, like a soft gasp she couldn't hold in. A couple heads turned to look at the map. Ms. R's jaw flexed once. She hadn't expected me to bring the whole cul-de-sac into the room with me. The chair cleared his throat, asked for a short recess, and told me they'd deliberate. I nodded and stepped back to a chair, heart steady, palms a little sweaty, because even when you're calm, your body still knows you're in a fight. They disappeared into a side room for 10 minutes. When they came back, the chair said the committee would review the survey method and that enforcement was temporarily paused pending documentation. He asked the management company to provide me the full survey report within 7 business days. 7 days. My deadline had vanished in one sentence. Ms. R's smile didn't move, but her whole posture went rigid. If she was a chess player, this was the moment someone told her the board in front of her was actually checkers. But I wasn't done yet. Because pausing enforcement wasn't the same as fixing the problem. And I could still feel her simmering beside that table like a kettle with the lid clamped down. I walked out of the hearing with a calm that tasted a little metallic, the way adrenaline does when it decides to behave. The sky had brightened by then, and the parking lot shimmered faintly with leftover morning dew, but I didn't linger. On paper, I'd won breathing room. The ultimatum was dead. The buyers wouldn't see chaos at inspection. No fines would hit our closing file this week. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was the end of Act 1. I sat in my car for a minute, letting the engine idle. My phone buzzed with a message from our agent asking how it went. I kept it simple: enforcement paused, survey required, we're good for inspection. She sent back a thumbs up and a reminder to stay calm if the board tried anything else. If only she knew. Because as I drove home, I realized the board hadn't actually given me the survey. They'd promised it in 7 business days, which was basically a polite way of saying, not before your inspection. It was a stalling move, maybe to save face, maybe to regroup. And Ms. R doesn't regroup unless she's planning something. Sure enough, by that evening, the neighborhood group chat started humming. Not about my fence exactly, but about new standards and survey confusion. People were asking if anyone else had been measured. A couple neighbors said they'd seen the surveyor on the street again, pointing toward backyards. That made my stomach drop for a different reason. If they were surveying now to justify retroactive enforcement, this wasn't just targeted pettiness anymore. It was a full HOA nightmare in the making for the whole cul-de-sac. At 7:10 p.m., another email arrived. This one wasn't addressed just to me. It was a community update. The board claimed the new survey revealed multiple fence height inconsistencies around the loop. They announced an immediate compliance initiative requiring all homes to confirm fence height within 14 days. Anyone found over 4 feet would be required to modify to current aesthetic standards. 4 feet. Again. They said the initiative was about uniform sightlines and modernizing standards. They attached a 1-page board agenda excerpt from their last closed session, trying to make it look like a long-planned policy. That agenda excerpt was my third evidence prop, and it was weak. It had no community vote record, no amendment language, no reference to CCR Section 4.3 at all. In other words, it was a memo they hoped nobody would read closely. I read it closely. There was no bylaw change. No amendment filed. No notice of a vote. They were trying to enforce an interpretation shift without doing the required work. Which meant if anyone challenged it, they'd have to either back down or drag half the neighborhood into violation notices. They'd chosen option 2. And guess who had pushed them into it by refusing to be the easy target? Me. I couldn't decide whether to feel proud or worried. Probably both. I forwarded the email to our agent so she'd know the board was expanding the issue. I also sent a quick note to Mr. K, because he'd warned me first and he deserved not to be blindsided. Then I went out to my backyard and stood by the fence. The sunset was orange behind the trees, casting long shadows across the panels. The fence looked the same as it had yesterday. Solid, protective, normal. The only thing that had changed was the board's hunger. The buyers were coming in 5 days. Even if enforcement was paused on me personally, the community-wide initiative could still spook them. Buyers hear compliance initiative and think future headaches. The board knew that. And that's when the money risk hit me like a cold wave. If this initiative scared the buyers into backing out, I'd lose not just the sale, but the deposit timeline, the moving costs already paid, and the new place we'd put an offer on. This wasn't house drama anymore. It was tens of thousands of dollars teetering on a board member's ego. At that moment, I realized Ms. R wasn't trying to enforce a rule. She was trying to punish a boundary. So I opened my laptop again. If they wanted to spread this fight to the neighborhood, I was going to make sure the neighborhood understood what was really happening. But I had to do it clean. No ranting. No chaos. Just facts arranged like dominoes. First, I drafted a short, calm email to the entire cul-de-sac list, no accusations, no emotion. I explained what happened at my hearing, that enforcement was paused because the board couldn't provide the survey or method, and that CCR Section 4.3 still permitted 6-foot fences unless amended by community vote. I urged everyone to request the full survey report before taking any action. I didn't mention Ms. R. I didn't even say selective enforcement. I just laid out the timeline. A fence doesn't need drama to be defended, it needs clarity. Second, I pulled up the association's amendment process from our bylaws. Any change to exterior structural standards requires notice, a quorum vote, and filing with the county registry. If they hadn't done that, they weren't enforcing a rule. They were improvising one. Third, I started logging every board communication I got from this point forward. Dates. Language. Attachments. Because if all this escalated into a bigger confrontation, I wanted a clean paper trail. By the time I shut the laptop, it was nearly midnight. The house was quiet, boxes stacked like silent witnesses around the living room. I felt tired in my bones. But I also felt sharp. This wasn't personal anymore, even if it started that way. This was about a board testing how far they could bend the neighborhood without snapping it. And I knew exactly where that snap point was. The next couple days moved fast, like the cul-de-sac had become a stage set and everyone was suddenly aware the lights were on. The email I sent spread through the loop in that quiet neighbor network way. People replied with questions, concern, and a little bit of shock. A lot of shock. Several neighbors said they'd never heard of a 4-foot limit. One sent a screenshot of the exact CCR Section 4.3 language from her own binder matching mine. Another said he'd built his fence 5 years ago with written approval for 6 feet. The more people compared notes, the more obvious it became that the board had not amended anything. They were just declaring. Ms. R, I'm sure, was not enjoying the sudden collective memory of rules. On day 3 after the hearing, survey packets began appearing in mailboxes. Not the full survey report, just a short letter with a checkbox grid, confirm your fence height, sign, and return. It had a subtle warning about non-compliance consequences, but still no actual method or data. It was like being asked to confess to a crime without being told what the crime was. Most neighbors ignored it. A couple asked for more info. One person, who I suspected was loosely aligned with Ms. R, posted a message saying we should just comply for the sake of harmony. Harmony is always the word people use when they mean obedience. Around noon that day, a management company representative walked the sidewalk with the surveyor. I watched from my front window as they paused at yards, glanced toward fences, scribbled notes. The sun was bright, and you could see their clipboards flashing white in the light. When they reached my driveway, they didn't step onto my land. Just stood, looked, whispered a bit, and moved on. That tiny choice, avoiding my property, told me everything. They knew I'd fight back if they crossed a line. So they were trying to build their case from a distance, hoping angles and dips would do the dirty work. That evening, Mr. K knocked on my door. The porch light cast a soft cone onto the steps, and I could hear distant traffic through the trees. He looked unsettled. He told me he'd received a pre-violation notice saying his fence might exceed the 4-foot standard. Mr. K has a 7-foot fence. Always has. It was approved by the board after a drainage fix years ago. He'd never been bothered about it until now. Same story from 2 more neighbors within an hour. One of them was the treasurer's next-door neighbor. That's the thing about trying to punish one person with a rule that hits 9 houses. You can only keep control as long as the others don't notice. And they were noticing. People were whispering about a special meeting. They were asking for records. A couple started digging through old approval emails. The loop was going from sleepy to mobilized. Ms. R tried to regain the narrative by sending another community update. This one was longer, more dramatic, full of phrases like new survey alignment and protecting shared view corridors. She said fences over 4 feet were historically discouraged, and that the board was correcting outdated enforcement gaps. That phrase, outdated enforcement gaps, was her attempt to rewrite history. But history was sitting in all our binders. The board scheduled a full community hearing for the initiative, set for the weekend, exactly 1 day before my buyer's inspection. Of course they did. They framed it as a helpful forum, but I read it for what it was, a pressure cooker. They wanted homeowners stressed and uncertain right before inspection season, hoping some people would preemptively cut fences down to avoid fines. Which meant I needed to go into that hearing ready to settle this once and for all. Not with rage. With structure. So the night before the meeting, I built a clean presentation for myself. Again, not flashy. Just 3 pillars. CCR Section 4.3 and its 6-foot allowance. The amendment requirements the board was skipping. Rule 3.14's consistency mandate. I also pulled my own original approval packet from when I resealed the fence 2 summers ago. The management company had sent a routine no objection note then, implicitly acknowledging my fence height was acceptable. That note dated June 7 became evidence prop number 4, tiny, but powerful. With that in hand, I felt ready. But I still couldn't ignore the timing, 1 day before inspection. That was the blade part of this. The part designed to cut at my sale. I told myself one thing as I packed my folder again: if they wanted to stage a public showdown, I'd make sure the public saw the truth. The Saturday meeting was standing room crowded. The sky outside was overcast and heavy, and raindrops ticked on the windows in thin, restless lines. The board sat at the front like usual, but tonight the room's energy belonged to the homeowners. People weren't angry yet. They were alert. That's a different, more dangerous kind of crowd for a board. The chair opened with a speech about community standards. Ms. R followed with a slideshow of before and after photos of fences from other neighborhoods, trying to sell the idea that shorter fences made for a more open, friendly atmosphere. The irony of showing openness slides while refusing to share the survey data wasn't lost on anyone. When homeowner comment opened, 3 people spoke before me. One asked for the full survey report. Another asked where the 4-foot standard came from. The third asked why the board agenda excerpt didn't reference a bylaw amendment. Ms. R tried to answer each one with smooth, vague language: ongoing review, board discretion, alignment initiative. You could see patience thinning like paper in rain. Then I stood. My heart was steady, my voice calm. The overhead lights hummed faintly. I didn't start with my fence. I started with process. I reminded everyone that CCR Section 4.3 allows fences up to 6 feet. I read the relevant portion succinctly. I said that if the board wanted to change that standard, they had a defined amendment process requiring community vote and formal filing. Then I held up the board agenda excerpt they'd attached earlier and pointed out that it didn't record any amendment vote or legal filing, just a closed session, initiative discussion. Finally, I invoked Rule 3.14 by name. I said accelerated enforcement without safety reason wasn't permitted, and consistency was mandatory across similarly situated properties. If this initiative was real, it had to apply to all fences equally, and homeowners needed the survey method to verify compliance. I kept my tone simple, almost boring. Because boring is lethal to drama. Ms. R's face tightened as I spoke, but she couldn't interrupt without looking exactly like what she was. When I finished, the room wasn't loud. It was quiet. The kind of quiet where people are thinking. The chair asked the management company rep to explain why full survey reports weren't provided. The rep fumbled, said data was still being compiled, and that they'd only received preliminary notes from the surveyor. Preliminary notes. So they were enforcing a community-wide fence reduction based on preliminary notes. Not even final data. That admission landed heavy. A few heads shook. Someone muttered about overreach. Another person said they wouldn't sign anything until the full report was released. Ms. R tried to pivot to good faith compliance, suggesting homeowners could voluntarily lower fences while waiting for final data. No one moved. The chair, sensing the mood, proposed a motion to pause the initiative until the full survey report was distributed and a legal review confirmed whether a standard change required a vote. Ms. R looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. She whispered something to the chair, but he didn't budge. He asked for board votes. 2 hands went up immediately. The third hesitated, then raised his. Ms. R was the only no. The motion passed. In 1 vote, the 4-foot pressure campaign stalled. The board couldn't enforce what they couldn't prove. People started filing out, talking quietly, relief mixing with irritation. The rain outside had eased into a soft drizzle. I stayed behind long enough to hear Ms. R tell the chair they were rewarding non-compliance. He said something I couldn't fully hear, but his tone sounded firm, like someone tired of being pushed into corners. I walked to my car with a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The board had tried to force a sudden 4-foot fence rule with no vote and no survey data. By invoking CCR Section 4.3 and Rule 3.14 publicly, I got the initiative paused for the whole cul-de-sac. But the meeting ending didn't mean Ms. R was done. It meant she was embarrassed. And embarrassed power doesn't go quiet. It gets creative. I woke up Sunday to sunlight breaking through the clouds, puddles glittering on the street like tiny mirrors. Inspection day. The buyers were coming at noon. My house was clean, staged, and calm on the surface. But under that calm, I felt the neighborhood tension still buzzing, like a phone left on vibrate. At 9:07 a.m., 2 hours before inspection, another email hit the cul-de-sac list. This one wasn't from the board officially. It was from Ms. R herself, using that concerned neighbor tone she loves. She claimed the board pause was temporary, that homeowners should prepare for adjustments, and that any property transferring ownership would be reassessed for compliance prior to closing. In other words, she was trying to resurrect the pressure without a vote. She didn't attach rules. She didn't mention CCR Section 4.3. She just threatened reassessment like a ghost story meant to scare buyers from the bushes. It was a social move, not a procedural one. And it told me she'd shifted from board leverage to neighbor leverage. I read it once, then forwarded it to my agent with a note: "This is not board policy. We're compliant per CCR. Inspection should proceed normally." I didn't want the buyers hearing any of this unless necessary. Still, I could imagine her angle. If she could force me to cut the fence, she could at least poison the well on my way out. Social shame. Neighborhood whispers. The classic small power exit swipe. And right there, with inspection just hours away, I realized she was about to try turning the cul-de-sac against me, making me the villain who caused trouble before leaving. If she could paint me as the selfish seller who broke harmony, maybe the board would feel pressured to reverse the pause, or at least make my last weeks miserable. Cool. If she wanted to play that game, I was ready to start mine. Not loud. Not reckless. Just precise. Because retaliation doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like letting someone's own rules tighten around them. The inspectors arrived on time. The buyers didn't show, as usual. We kept everything professional, smooth, normal. My fence stood tall behind the property like a quiet promise of privacy, and I watched those inspectors walk the yard without a single note about it. After they left, I felt the first true wave of relief in days. The sale was still alive. But I also knew something else now. Ms. R had moved from enforcement to sabotage. She'd tried deadline pressure, it failed. She'd tried community-wide fear, it stalled. Now she was aiming at reputation, hoping to make me feel unwelcome, guilty, rushed. And I don't do guilt from people who break their own bylaws. So I opened my continuity ledger, the one where I'd been logging every communication. I added her Sunday email. I noted the timing. I saved a copy. Then I started drafting a new letter. Not to the cul-de-sac this time. To the full association list. It was going to be polite. It was going to be factual. It was going to remind everyone that board members cannot issue unofficial compliance threats, especially during an initiated pause, and that any policy change requires a formal vote. I didn't send it yet. I just wrote it, tightened it, and waited for the exact right moment. Because the best revenge in a neighborhood isn't chaos. It's making the right people read the right words when they have no way to wiggle out. And by the way Ms. R was spiraling, that moment was coming fast. By Monday morning, the cul-de-sac had that post-storm brightness to it, the kind where everything looks clean but the air still remembers the lightning. I was halfway through taping a box shut when my phone buzzed with a message from the management company. It wasn't a violation notice. Not exactly. It was an update saying the survey report would be delayed further due to technical review, and that the board was working on clarifying standards. Clarifying standards. That's board speak for, we got caught, now we're looking for a loophole. I added it to my ledger and kept packing. I wasn't going to chase them. I wanted them to move next. People who are scrambling for control tend to trip over their own feet if you don't hold them up. Around noon, Mr. K texted me that Ms. R had been going door to door over the weekend, talking to a few neighbors about how I was making things hard for the community. She'd framed it like I was the reason the initiative paused, like I'd somehow invented rules that didn't exist. Which was hilarious, because I'd literally just read them out loud. But I could feel what she was doing. She was building a social narrative in the gap where her procedural one collapsed. Trying to shame the homeowner who wouldn't bend. I reread my draft letter to the full association, still polite, still factual. I tightened one paragraph about board members issuing unofficial threats. I didn't send it yet. I wanted the moment to land when the board was most exposed. Then, because I'm not allergic to irony, I checked the association website. The board had posted a proposed fence height clarification for vote consideration at their next monthly meeting. It claimed the community had always intended a 4-foot rear fence standard and that CCR Section 4.3 was outdated. Outdated? The bylaws aren't a fashion trend. You don't just label something outdated because you don't like losing. They also scheduled the vote for Thursday night. That was 3 days away, just after my inspection report window, and still before closing. Suddenly the stakes were clear. If they pushed a 4-foot clarification through now, they could retroactively claim my fence was non-compliant and re-trigger enforcement before closing. Even if it was legally shaky, it could create enough uncertainty to rattle buyers. It was a last-ditch move. A sloppy one. And here's where the legal consequence angle snapped into focus. If the board tried to rewrite CCR Section 4.3 without a proper amendment vote, they weren't just being petty, they were violating their own governance rules. That kind of overreach doesn't just embarrass a board, it can invalidate enforcement entirely. Which meant this Thursday meeting wasn't just a debate. It was the moment they would either correct course, or hang themselves with their own process. I didn't want to be dramatic about it. But I also wasn't about to let a clarification sabotage my sale because one board member couldn't take a no. So I called my agent and gave her a clean summary. Board attempting to reinterpret fence standard. Meeting scheduled. Sale still safe for now. She told me to keep everything documented and to avoid direct confrontation with Ms. R outside official channels. Smart advice. I already planned to follow it. Then I did something I hadn't done yet in all this, I emailed the board chair directly. Not a fight email. A clarity email. I attached CCR Section 4.3, highlighted the amendment requirements, and asked him to confirm the Thursday vote was an amendment procedure with quorum, not a clarification. I also asked that the full survey report be distributed to all homeowners before any vote. No accusations. Just questions that force definitions. He replied later that night, shorter than usual. He said the board was seeking counsel on process, and that homeowners would receive additional materials before the meeting. Counsel on process. Translation, they knew they were on thin ice. I went to bed that night not fully relaxed, but steady. The ceiling fan whirred softly, and outside, a distant lawnmower sounded like a low engine hum. The board had moved to Phase 3. And now I was going to let them walk into their own spotlight. Tuesday and Wednesday were quiet in the way that makes you suspicious. No new emails. No survey updates. No fresh threats. But the neighborhood wasn't quiet anymore. A few homeowners had started sharing old approval letters in the group chat. Fence approvals. Height waivers. Emails from past boards explicitly allowing 6 feet because of slope. Once people start producing receipts, a power play has a hard time staying mysterious. Ms. R tried to clap it back by posting that old approvals were invalid under new standards. She was basically speedrunning a rewrite of history. But history doesn't vanish just because someone gets loud. By Wednesday night, several neighbors told me they planned to attend Thursday's board meeting and speak. Not because of me specifically, but because of what this had exposed. People don't like feeling manipulated, especially by someone who pretends they're protecting harmony. I kept packing and stayed out of side conversations. I didn't want to be the ringleader. I didn't need to be. The truth was already doing its job. That afternoon, the management company finally sent a partial survey file to homeowners. It wasn't a full report. It was a 2-page summary with a diagram showing reference grade points. And there it was, in black and white. They'd measured fences from the lowest grade point on each lot, not from the adjacent established grade as CCR Section 4.3 requires. The survey basically confirmed what I'd said at my hearing. The method was skewed. Most fences in the cul-de-sac would read overheight under that method, even though they were standard 6-foot panels. They'd chosen a measuring system that would manufacture violations. I added the summary to my folder, labeled it clearly, and printed 3 copies. One for me, one for my agent if needed, and one for the board meeting. Because now this wasn't just a fairness argument. It was a documented mismatch between bylaw language and board practice. And once that mismatch lands in a public meeting, you can't unring it. I didn't sleep much Wednesday night. Not from anxiety, more from that half-excited, half-calm feeling you get before a big reveal. The kind where your brain keeps rehearsing sentences you might not even need. By Thursday evening, I was ready. The board meeting was packed again, even more than Saturdays. The clubhouse felt smaller with that many bodies and that much quiet tension. Outside, dusk was settling, and you could hear crickets starting up near the sidewalk, a soft rhythmic background like a countdown. The chair opened with a statement about community unity and updating interpretations. Ms. R looked composed, but I could see the tightness at the corners of her mouth. She didn't have the room on her side anymore. They presented their clarification. They said CCR Section 4.3 was ambiguous about grade and that the board had authority to interpret it for aesthetic consistency. Then they opened homeowner comment. Neighbor after neighbor stood up with paperwork. A 6-foot approval letter from 2018. A slope exemption note from 2021. A screenshot from the association's own FAQ page stating rear fences could be up to 6 feet unless visible from the street. It was like watching a wall build itself brick by brick. Finally, I stood. I kept it short. I held up the survey summary and pointed to the grade reference method. I said the survey confirmed the board was measuring from the lowest dip, which created artificial overheight readings. I reminded them CCR Section 4.3 specifies grade in a way that reflects established adjacent levels, not the deepest point on a slope. Then I said one line that I'd been saving for the exact right moment. Under Rule 3.14, enforcement must be consistent and based on valid measurement aligned with the CCR. If the board wanted a 4-foot standard, they needed a formal amendment vote, not a clarification after the fact. No anger. No shaking hands. Just clear structure. There was a pause after I sat down. The kind of pause where even the board laptop fans sound loud. Then the chair did something I didn't expect. He said, out loud, that the board had consulted counsel and confirmed that any change from 6 feet to 4 feet required a community amendment process. Therefore, the clarification would be withdrawn, and enforcement would continue under the existing 6-foot standard as written. Withdrawn. Ms. R's head snapped toward him like she'd been slapped with air. She started to object, but the chair cut her off gently and said the vote was no longer necessary. He also added that the board would issue a revised survey guidance document aligning measurement with CCR Section 4.3, and that no homeowner would be fined under the preliminary method. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The whole room exhaled for me. Neighbors clapped, a small, contained applause, not a roar, but enough to make the moment echo. Ms. R looked frozen. Not humiliated exactly. More like someone watching the exit door close slowly in front of them. The chair moved on to the next agenda item. But the meeting's real climax had already happened. And in that moment, I felt something settle into place. This wasn't just about my fence surviving. It was the neighborhood reclaiming the rules from someone who treated them like props. I walked out into the cool night with a calm that finally felt real. The fence would stay. The sale would close. The board had reversed itself publicly, and the reversal was documented in the minutes forever. That was the satisfying part. But the revenge part? The revenge part was still quietly unfolding. Because here's what a lot of people missed in the excitement: when a board publicly withdraws a clarification because it violates process, it also exposes the person who pushed it hardest. And Saturday's minutes were already showing Ms. R as the sole no vote on the pause. Thursday's minutes would show her trying to force a vote against council guidance. In boards like ours, that matters. It's the paper trail that turns a bully's confidence into a liability. The fallout started the next morning. Not loud, not cinematic. More like a quiet shift in the neighborhood's temperature. Ms. R didn't email anyone. She didn't post. She wasn't outside doing her usual driveway patrol. It was like she'd pulled her presence back behind her own fence. Meanwhile, the chair sent an official community statement confirming the 6-foot rule remained, outlining the corrected grade method, and apologizing for confusion. Apologizing for confusion is the softest form of accountability, but in association land, it was still accountability. Several neighbors thanked me in passing, quick waves, small smiles, nothing gushy. The kind of appreciation that knows the fight was bigger than me. Mr. K stopped by with a coffee and that relieved look people get when the thing they feared suddenly can't hurt them anymore. He said the cul-de-sac felt lighter. I told him it's easy to feel light once someone stops pressing down on your shoulders. The buyer's inspection report came back clean. A few tiny items, nothing structural. We negotiated smoothly. At no point did the fence come up as an issue because there was no longer an issue to raise. The board had made sure of that. The timing couldn't have been better if I'd scripted it myself. By the next weekly association update, a new item appeared on the agenda: board member conduct and communication standards. I didn't need to ask who that was about. In a community where everything gets recorded, the biggest consequence isn't getting yelled at. It's getting written down. I didn't attend that meeting. I didn't need to. I was already halfway into moving logistics, and I didn't want to be a spectator to her reckoning. The neighborhood would handle it. That was part of the theme I'd been living inside this whole time: boundaries aren't just lines you defend alone. They're limits a community enforces when it remembers who it belongs to. 2 weeks later, right before closing, the management company emailed me a formal compliance clearance for the property. It stated the rear fence was compliant under CCR Section 4.3 and that no outstanding violations existed. Clean. Simple. Final. I forwarded it to my agent and let myself breathe. When closing day came, it was sunny and mild. The house was mostly empty by then, rooms echoing a little, and my footsteps sounded louder than usual on the hardwood. I walked through the backyard one last time, hand brushing the top edge of the fence. The wood felt warm from the sun, alive with that quiet steadiness it had always had. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grateful. Grateful I didn't fold to a 72-hour scare tactic. Grateful I learned the rules deeply enough to use them. Grateful that a neighborhood can still choose community over control when you give it a chance. And yes, grateful that Ms. R couldn't take one last swing at my home sale. Some people leave a place with a slam. I left it with a line in the minutes that said, 6 feet stays 6 feet. After we moved, the cul-de-sac started fading into memory the way neighborhoods do, first as specific houses, then as a feeling, then as a story you tell someone at dinner. But the fence saga stayed sharp. It was less about wood and inches now, more about what happens when power forgets it's supposed to serve people, not squeeze them. My agent texted me a week after closing to say the buyers were thrilled, already hosting a backyard dinner, already loving the privacy. She said they'd heard about some fence drama but were relieved it resolved before they stepped in. I didn't tell her everything. She didn't need the whole loop. She just needed the ending. And the ending, at least for me, was clean. Cost-wise, it wasn't free. I spent hours on research, nights on emails, and energy I would have rather used packing. But I didn't pay fines. I didn't lose the sale. And I didn't let a board weaponize fear just because they could. Sometimes closure doesn't look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a fence still standing when you drive away. Tell me your HOA fence ultimatum horror in one line.